Good morning, A-Pushers. This is Dr. Killo here today to talk with you about the Kennedy administration, also known as Camelot, after the musical that had come out at the time of King Arthur's Court, a very popular musical and had some connections to the Kennedy administration. Let's see if we can figure that out. All right, so in 1960, Kennedy runs against Richard Nixon, who had been vice president under Eisenhower. Kennedy had been a senator from Massachusetts. Um, they were both young, same age, same history, both served in the Navy, both came up through Congress. So there's a lot in common between the two guys. Um, so Kennedy here ends up winning the nomination, picks Lyndon Johnson to be his vice presidential candidate. Johnson's from Texas, so it kind of gives Kennedy the support from the South, Texas, and from Massachusetts, where he's from. So that's a big boost to him. He is the first Roman Catholic since Al Smith. He ends up having to go on television during the campaign and appeal to the American people to convince them that he would not vote the way the Pope tells him to, because many people in America still were very anti-Catholic, especially in the South. And by the way, the South is Democrat, and the South tends to not like Catholics. So that was a problem for Kennedy. So we'll see in the map here coming up how that plays out. But in New England, where the Irish live and the Italians live, they loved him. I have a mother-in-law, last name Mangiarucco, very Italian, and she loves Kennedy. So that tells you something. All right, so they end up having a debate on television, 4 debates. One of the debates, I think it's the last one in October, Nixon had been sick and in the hospital. And when they had the debate, Kennedy wore makeup. Nixon did not. Kennedy looked good on the black and white television. Nixon literally had sweat dripping off his nose. That had an effect. Where Nixon had been leading in the polls up until that debate. After that debate, Kennedy leads in the polls till the election and ends up winning the election. So never let it be said that Americans care about substance. We don't. We just care about how you look on television. All right, so there's Kennedy. Yeah, kind of good looking. And his wife, Jackie, very popular woman at the time, too. All right, so again, Kennedy wins, kind of a comfortable win. He had a lot of support from African Americans in the South again, but the whites in the South kind of split their vote with him. Yeah, and we're going to see the beginnings. This is, continuing the racial strategies we have in America at this time. You see, normally the South votes Democratic, with a few exceptions, Truman. But this time they still vote Democratic, but you'll see a couple states split off and support another Democrat, but not Kennedy because Kennedy's Catholic. Kennedy's big support up here in the Northeast, and Nixon kind of wins, scattered places all over the place. Yeah. All right, so Eisenhower leaves. Good for him. Kennedy, let's talk about his administration because there's actually a lot to talk about. This is the inaugural speech. Watch it. It's a good speech. Some memorable lines. So Kennedy promised to get the country moving again. I'm not really sure what that means because it wasn't like we were standing still during the 50s. Our economy's doing great. There is some foreign policy, but we're trying to keep things on the down low. I don't know what he means by that, but okay. It is a glamorous presidency. Jackie's pregnant when they enter office. They've got 2 little kids that are very adorable. They're both young. They're both, people can relate to them. He's the youngest elected president, but not the youngest president. Who might that be? Yeah, he has a cabinet around him of very smart young people. That people like that. It was, again, King Arthur. This is his court. Okay. His attorney general is his brother, another good-looking young man at the time. Wants to go after the mob and civil rights violations. J. Edgar Hoover is the head of the FBI. He wants nothing to do with that. Not that he likes the mob, but he hates black people, so he's not going to go after civil rights violators. In fact, as you'll see in the later administrations, he begins to target them. Civil rights protesters. He wants to go after the civil rights leaders themselves. So yeah, not a good guy. Yeah. Okay. So his speech. He talks about his domestic policy being the new frontier. Kind of a democratic, platform. Suggests the idea of a Peace Corps. This is kind of cool. This is where you would go overseas and you would spend 2 years working to help some African community or South American community or Southeast Asian community, build schools, whatever. It was a great public relations effort by the United States to get these third world countries on our side rather than, you know, force them militarily to be our friends. We kind of used the Peace Corps to get them on our side. It was a decent idea, and a lot of folks who were young at the time joined the Peace Corps, went around the world, you know, spread goodwill and all that good stuff. It was good. And again, Kennedy's appeal to young people during his inauguration really resonated with the baby boom generation. They identified with him. He's the first president born in the 20th century. He's the youngest elected president. They connected with Kennedy. So when Kennedy asked them to get involved and do things, they did it. All right. So Peace Corps very popular. Congress not so much a fan of Kennedy. The Democrats, again, they're not all on his side. The Republicans are definitely not on his side, and they don't really cooperate with him. His domestic agenda doesn't really pan out, doesn't really happen. Yeah. So what does he get done here? Key medical and education bills are stalled in Congress. Congress rejects his plan to cut taxes as an economic boost. Doesn't that sound like a Republican? How about that? And he helped negotiate and enforce the non-inflationary wage agreement in the steel industry. So he's trying to help labor there because, you know, they did help him get the election. So good for him. He talks about going to space. Now remember, we had just had Sputnik, where the Soviets proved that they were ahead of us technologically, despite what Nixon's talking about with the kitchen debate and consumer items. That's ridiculous. But America was feeling a little bit, you know, intimidated by the Soviets and their rockets. So he pledges in 1961, I believe, that we're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade, as he says. And so that starts the whole Apollo space program to get us to the moon, which we did in 1969. And there's the Earth from space. Kind of cool. And there we are. Ooh, what alien took the picture, I wonder? I don't know. Anyway, kind of cool. So let's talk about foreign policy because that's where Kennedy does his best work. One of the first things that happens is the Berlin Wall. The Russians sense a weakness with Kennedy. He is young, and they want to try to take advantage of that. So they put up a wall in Berlin to divide the city. Now remember, they had to put the wall up because everyone is fleeing the east, where communism is, to get to the west. And so they couldn't stop them from doing it, so they just put up a wall one day. And again, if you watch Bridge of Spies, great movie to show that. Yeah, so wasn't working out too well for them. And there's the wall going up. I'd like to be these poor schmucks, having to keep people from crossing the wall. I mean, what does that say about your country that you have to like wall them in? Not wall them out, wall them in. That's pretty sad. And there's the wall coming down in 1989. These are communist troops up here just watching the whole thing, thinking, I can't wait to get me a Coca-Cola and a hamburger. Yeah, because they didn't have that in East. All right. So Kennedy's foreign policy, again, he didn't like the idea of brinkmanship under Dulles and Eisenhower because that was a stupid idea to begin with. He comes up with this idea of flexible response, meaning, you know, no matter what the incident is, we don't have to threaten them with nuclear weapons. We can do other things. And he kind of focuses his idea on having multiple options for any given event that takes place in the world. He kind of begins this idea of globalization by cutting tariffs around the world. The European Union doesn't exist yet, but they are beginning to create an organization, the European Economic Community, which eventually becomes the EU. Kennedy starts, you know, cutting the tariffs with them to increase economic trade, and again begins this whole idea of globalization. One of the other big things that's going on at this time period is decolonization, which is actually kind of a problem in foreign policy. It used to be, you know, that European powers controlled all the third world countries. In the 1950s and 60s, they began to pull back, which means those countries are now independent and up for grabs. Are they going to side with the Soviets? Or are they going to side with us? But when they were under the European control, they were kind of under our control. But that all ends in the 1950s and 60s, and it causes us some problems. Right? So, yeah, we're going to see that in Vietnam. So again, the idea is to have a flexible response. In Vietnam, we are supporting, as I said under Eisenhower, a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem, who is the corrupt leader of South Vietnam. Kennedy doesn't like him. We do give Ngo Dinh Diem military advisors because the North eventually attacks the South and tries to undermine their government. So we send military advisors, not U.S. combat troops, just advisors, military people, to help the South Vietnamese army fight off the North. That obviously gets escalated over time. Um, yeah, it was tough for Kennedy. Kennedy did not like No Din Diem. One day, when some military generals asked him about his opinion of No Din Diem, Kennedy said that he wouldn't be upset if he was removed from power. Like the next week, they assassinated him. Kennedy, I don't think, saw that coming, honestly. Was a little bit surprised by the fact that he got No Din Diem killed. Whatever. But so anyway, um, so we continue to help Vietnam. Kennedy eventually, right before he dies, he kind of says, "Look, we're pulling out of Vietnam. It's a civil war. It's not worth our time. We can't win it." But unfortunately for America, he gets killed, and that policy goes down the drain. All right, so in Latin America, he has this Alliance for Progress, which is basically us giving lots of money to Latin American countries, in addition to sending our Peace Corps down there. But we're giving them money to help them prevent them from becoming communists, like we did in Europe at the end of World War II, the Marshall Plan. All right, so here's one of Kennedy's biggest failures. So as Eisenhower is leaving office, Eisenhower has developed a plan to remove Fidel Castro from Cuba. Castro in 1959 had overthrown the American-backed dictator there, and so Eisenhower didn't get a chance to get his plan put in action before he left office. So he kind of hands it off to Kennedy. So Kennedy comes in here, and the military people say, "Hey, Kennedy, we got this plan to kick Castro out of Cuba." And the plan is take all of the people that have fled from Cuba, all the men, train them by the CIA, give them weapons, and send them back to Cuba to overthrow Castro. Kennedy's not so sure about this plan, but he's new as president, and he wants to, if Eisenhower approved it, then it must be good. So there you go. So he says, okay, let's go ahead and invade Cuba with these, refugees, but we're not going to use any American airplanes. He pulls back the air power. Huge mistake. The Cubans end up using their air force to destroy the invasion in a place called the Bay of Pigs. That's actually the name of the bay. And it's a huge embarrassment because even though Kennedy tried to say, hey, we weren't responsible for this, it was these Cuban refugees that did it. We didn't do it. The whole world knew we were lying. So here we got caught trying to overthrow a country, and worst of all, we failed at doing it. So it didn't work out real well. Over time, you'll see, because Castro's now afraid of us, he asked the Soviets for protection. The Soviets give him weapons, nuclear weapons, put into Cuba, which causes a problem later on, otherwise known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right. So, yeah. So what happens is in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we discover that these nuclear weapons are in Cuba with a U-2 spy plane that we fly over Cuba. That leads to 12 days in October of 1962, where Kennedy's saying, look, get those missiles out or else, and the Cubans are saying no. And the Soviets are saying, well, we're going to keep supplying the Cubans because they're our ally and we don't like America. So this leads to a standoff. There's actually Americans in our military that are calling for Kennedy to nuke the Soviet Union, to attack first because they will eventually attack us. Let's hit them first. There are people in Khrushchev's government who are telling him to nuke America first. We came very, very close to a nuclear war in 1962. Kennedy had quarantined Cuba. He called it a quarantine because a blockade is an act of war. And he eventually gets an agreement with him and Khrushchev. They actually called each other on the phone, and we agreed to not invade Cuba and kick out Castro. And the Soviets agreed to withdraw their nuclear missiles. We also agreed at a later date to withdraw our nuclear missiles from Turkey, which was right on the Soviets' border, and they didn't like that either. So it ended up working out. So no war. Here's Kennedy's speech to America that terrified the daylights out of people. Here's a picture of Vietnam to kind of let you know what's going on here. Again, 17th parallels where it's divided, which is, I guess, is right here. North Vietnam is communist. South Vietnam is, I don't know what it is. It's not free, but whatever. Again, Cuban Missile Crisis. So eventually we put in this hotline so that Kennedy could contact the Soviets whenever he needed to prevent nuclear war. Kennedy then goes on this tour to try to convince America that, hey, the Soviets aren't as bad as we think. Maybe that would have been a good idea back when Truman was president, but by now people are convinced the Soviets are trying to destroy the world and take us over and all that stuff. Unfortunately for Kennedy, again, on a campaign trip in 1963, November 22nd, he is killed in Dallas, Texas. I've got the video here of the Zapruder, and that's the announcement that Kennedy's dead. In the end, Kennedy doesn't really accomplish much, but people remember him for being somebody who inspired them. Thank you very much and have a good day.